Okay, so let's go back a long, long, long way to the 1970s. So it was in the 1970s that we first started to produce what are called integrated circuits. So it was a little company called Intel created these magical little integrated circuits that had many transistors on them. They then developed, unbelievably, a 4-bit microprocessor called the 4004. And it was the first microprocessor, and it was the first time that we could actually program our devices so that they could change their operation. So back then, we had maybe hundreds or maybe thousands of transistors that fitted onto our silicon, and the transistors were still quite large. But over the years, we've actually managed to get more and more transistors onto each microchip that we have. And this has allowed us to be able to increase the processing power, the memory, and so on. And it was in that time, Gordon Moore, who invented the integrated circuit, came up with this uh, law that the number of transistors on a microchip roughly doubles every 2 years. So when you think about it, the computer that you have now, in 2 years' time, you're probably going to have double the amount of memory and double the amount of processing overall. In fact, 4 times well, for 2 years. So we've generally seen the rise of computing power over the years. To give you some idea, we're now up at 50 billion transistors actually on a chip now. So the processor that you're using in your computer just now is likely to have tens of billions of transistors actually on it. And the size of those transistors are 5 nanometers. So they're absolutely so small now. And when you think about the size of an atom is probably only a tenth of the size of the transistor, we're getting to the point that we can't actually produce our transistors any smaller. So the challenge that we have now is how are we going to keep increasing the demand for processing? And obviously one area that we could do is to stop using silicon and stop using our digital binary digits. And if we can get away from using these devices, we could actually increase the processing power, the amount of memory that we have, and so on. So the next spectrum that we should be using is the optical spectrum. And rather than sending electrical signals, which have resistance and capacitance and so on, we should be sending light, photons, just like we do with our communications. Fiber communications allow for billions of times more data to go through than a copper cable actually can. So the next dimension is really to move away from silicon and towards a quantum future. In fact, the only company in the world which can produce these really small transistors is one in Taiwan, a company called TSMC, and they make these tiny little transistors, which is a big risk for the world because obviously if there was a problem in that factory, then it would cut short all of our processing, our microelectronics devices that we actually need. So the future is possibly towards the usage of qubits. So qubits really changes our understanding of our circuits, our electronic circuits and our processing, where we now have a qubit of information. And that qubit, the qubit can exist in several different states, such as the spin of the qubit and so on. So we then end up with a whole lot of different types of gates that would implement normally our Boolean circuits. This one here, this gate here, will rotate the qubit by 180 degrees within inside the x-axis. This one here will rotate it 180 degrees on the y-axis. So in this way, we can actually represent our binary data in some sort of form and also implement all of the logic that we actually need to be able to do our processing. So a quantum computer is really processing with qubits rather than with bits and of data. And one of the strange things that we have with qubits is superposition. And with superposition, we can actually, something can exist in different states at the same time, in different places. So here I am in Edinburgh and in Glasgow, and it's possible for me to be in both places at the same time. And only when I sample the qubit do I actually determine where I am or in which state I actually am. And it's this this opportunity that opens up a whole lot of new applications for this type of technology. But it was Peter Shaw who came up with an amazing algorithm. Okay, this is what this is what a quantum circuit actually looks like with its gates. And there's the qubits propagating there overall. So in the future, rather our normal circuits that we'd have, our normal logic, will be replaced by these quantum circuits. So he came up with an algorithm which allowed us to be able to factorize a modulus. So if you remember when we covered the RSA method, we created a modulus which was two prime numbers multiplied together, p times q. Normally these are about 1,000 bits in size, which makes the modulus about 2,000 bits in size. At the current time, that is a really hard problem, and no computer in the world, even given a long, long time, would be able to factorize a 2K modulus back into its two original random prime numbers. So Peter came up with a method using qubits that allows us to be able to actually determine and factorize that value. Another problem that we have is that we use what's called discrete logarithms. And a discrete logarithm is a bit like this. G to the power of x mod p is equal to y. At the current time, it is really difficult for us to find out the value of x, even though we know y, g, and p. That's the discrete logarithm problem, or DLP. These are not provably hard problems, and with a small prime numbers, it's possible to factorize a value of n. It's just that they are so large that it's really difficult for a computer to do. So Peter found out that it was possible to break both the discrete logarithm problem and also the factorization of a modulus easily within a short time on a quantum computer, which means that all of our existing public key encryption methods, public key methods, such as RSA, elliptic curve cryptography, LGAML is another one, are all broken with quantum computers. When it comes to signatures, ECDSA, as used in Bitcoin, EDDSA, and RSA are all broken with this method. And what was mentioned earlier from one of our guest speakers is that we can have a capture now and crack later. So it's possible that someone could be listening to our communications now, capturing all the data, knowing that within 5 or 10 years, when they build a quantum computer, they could break the communications and reveal the data in some time in the future. So all of our existing methods, including our key exchange methods of ECDH, are all going to be broken because this method breaks public key methods. So what we really need is post-quantum cryptography. And Grover came up with another algorithm, and he said, well, on a quantum computer, we can run many, many things in parallel. all at the same time. And why don't we make these keys? So we could run maybe 1 to the power of 128 different keys all at the same time. That's still a lot of keys to try, but we could build up a dictionary of keys in a quantum computer and then try each of them. And what we find with this is that anything up to 128-bit symmetric key, such as AES, and 128-bit hashing methods, such as MD5, are weak in terms of Grover's algorithm. This method isn't exactly proven, so Shor's algorithm definitely breaks public key encryption. This method might be really difficult to implement in a real quantum computer. So this one's a less of a risk, but it's still a risk, which means that we learned 2 lessons here. One is that we need to migrate away from our public key encryption, public key methods. And 2, we need to upgrade our symmetric key and our hashing methods to 256-bit. Okay, and this is what's been defined by NIST. NIST have now agreed that that needs to happen within 5 years. The public key encryption methods and these symmetric and hashing methods will be deprecated, and from 2030 to 2035, they will be removed. By 2035, there will be no more public key methods that we have just now, and no more symmetric key and hashing methods, which are 128-bit strength. Okay, so that was Grover there who did this. So things are moving, and the EU is moving, and the US has already moved, and Biden signed a memorandum to say that all national critical infrastructure, education, energy, and government and so on will have to migrate to post-quantum cryptography within the next few years. So this is underway, and there is a strong statement that this needs to happen inside the US. And the same thing is happening in the UK and with the EU. And this is a tri-alliance between the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, the NSA, and NIST. So they are all working together to be able to migrate all of our existing public key methods to this post-quantum cryptography. And it's happening all over the world. And we've got 5 to 10 years to be able to migrate towards these new standards. So NIST has a long track record of standardizing things. They standardized SHA-1, SHA-256, well, SHA-2. They've standardized lightweight cryptography and other areas. And they started off their post-quantum standardization in 2016. They allowed researchers to be able to submit their methods, and after a long period of evaluation and scoring a number of rounds, they ended up with a set of standards, which I'll outline in a little minute. So these standards will relate to key exchange, and we now call it key encapsulation mechanism. It's slightly different. It doesn't use the Diffie-Hellman method anymore. It's a key encapsulation, which is equivalent to public key encryption. And obviously there are digital signatures. So the 2 main areas that they standardized is with key encapsulation. That's when I exchange a key with you to be able to create a symmetric key for the communication, and public key encryption, and also for digital signatures. So they've been publishing the standards over the past few years, and I'll outline these in a little minute, but there'll be more to come as we migrate. Because the last thing that we want is to have one method that we rely on, and we find that that method is then broken. We'll have no fallback. So NIST want to be able to create a main method and then have 2 or 3 methods which can actually be used as an alternative, just in case something breaks. And obviously in some applications, we have different types of requirements, and we could use different types of methods for that. So it's thought that within a year or two, then there is a 1 in 7 chance of breaking RSA 2K. RSA 2K is the standard that we use for digital signatures on the web. So when you connect to a website, it's typically an RSA public key which is used with the signature. So the basic trust in the website that you're connecting to is dependent upon RSA 2K. We could keep increasing, but with RSA, it becomes really, really slow. If we went to 4K or 8K or 16K, it's going to take us minutes, if not hours, to generate a key, and it isn't very efficient. It doesn't scale well. So by 2031, there's a 50% chance that we could break RSA 2K with a quantum computer built at scale. Obviously, there needs to be millions of qubits for this to happen. Just now, we're only about 100 qubits or so, but there are many governments that are working on this across the world, and there may be a breakthrough. And certainly by 2030, there is a reasonable chance that someone will be able to build a quantum computer at scale that can actually break RSA. Okay, so these are the basic hard problems that we have. Okay, so that's the hard problem there of factorizing with RSA. We can factorize into 2' numbers fairly easily with a quantum computer. The other one is the DLP, or the discrete logarithm problem. Actually, elliptic curves are based on this hard problem overall. So quantum computers breaking these methods will completely change the foundation of security that we actually have. Okay, so if you're interested in how it actually works, a little bit of physics here. So if you have a modulus n and it's p times q, then if you start two waves off, so this is a value here and then the value there. So if I set two waves to have a certain wavelength or frequency, and those waves are based on the 2' numbers, I can keep tuning my waves. And what I want to do is I want to create a null point at a certain point where the waves cross over from there on the x-axis. If I make that the equivalent of n, then I can measure the wavelength of the two waves as p and q. So with this, you can see how easy it would be to be able to tune two waves together, these qubits, and then to be able to measure a distance, which would be the modulus, and then look at the wavelength or the frequency of the two waves that are actually producing this. So this is the basis of Shor's algorithm for cracking RSA and also elliptic curves. So before we move on, let's do a little bit of Crypto 101. So in the first workshop, we covered the principles of cryptography. So I'd like to recap all of those principles, or many of those principles, so that we can understand what it is that's been broken here and what's been replaced. Okay, so when we started several weeks ago in our first workshop, we talked about Bob and Alice, A and B communicating with each other. And then we have Eve, the passive adversary, and Mallory, the active adversary. And in between, we have Trent, which is the trusted entity between Bob and Alice. Trent will prove Bob to Alice and vice versa, and so on. Okay, the first principle that we looked at was symmetric key method. So symmetric key is a little bit like your front door key. You will make a copy of that key for everybody that you trust to get into your house. You open, you lock the door with that key, and then you can open the door with the same key. So symmetric key encryption is really the workhorse of the industry. We typically use AES or Cha-Cha 20 as the two main symmetric key methods that are used overall. Okay, so as we found with post-quantum cryptography, we'll have to move that from 128-bit to 256-bit keys to be secure because of Grover's algorithm. Then we looked at the concept of a one-way hash. So is it possible to take some data and to create a fixed length hash? So for this, we have a number of hashing methods. MD5 has a small, relatively small hash of 128 bits. These days, we shouldn't really use that because it's really easy to create what's called a collision, and we take different data and we can engineer it so that it has the same MD5 hash value. SHA-1 is a lot more difficult to do that. It's 160 bits in length, but it's still possible, and it must be deprecated from the internet overall. The good hashes are these ones here. These are 256-bit hashes. So through Grosvenor's algorithms, we need to move our hashes from here to SHA, they're called SHA-2 here. It's also called SHA-256 or SHA-512 and so on. We can use SHA-3, which is in this standard. And we can also use Blake2B, which is a really fast hash. If we need variable length hashes, then we can use an XOF, such as Shake, will give us any size of hash that we actually need. Okay, but the main thing here for post-quantum is that these are gone and we need to migrate over to these types of hashes. Unfortunately, there are many databases and systems that are still using MD5 and SHA-1, and we need to get rid of those completely because they will be cracked with a quantum computer. And then we looked at key exchange. So key exchange is how can I get the key from Bob to Alice that we're going to use for the secure communication. For this, we can use the Diffie-Hellman method. When Bob has a secret, Alice has a secret, creates a public value of that, exchanges the value, and in the end, they end up with the same shared key. The main method we use here is what's called elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman. So we don't use discrete logs anymore. They're a bit too complex now in performance. We typically use elliptic curve cryptography to be able to exchange a key. And it's almost certain that the key we're using for the Zoom session for the security has been negotiated with elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman. Okay, and then we move on to public key encryption. Okay, encryption. And with this, Alice creates a key pair, such as with RSA, and then uses the public key to encrypt the data, and then she can then use her private key to be able to decrypt it. We can also use this in terms of key exchange, where if this isn't plain text, but this is a symmetric key that Bob wants Alice to use, we can actually encrypt the key with Alice's public key, send it over, she can decrypt that with a private key, so she ends up with the same key. So this is key exchange, but not using the Diffie-Hellman method. And with post-quantum cryptography, we use this method now. We don't use the Diffie-Hellman method. We now use this method of encrypting with a public key. So it's called key encapsulation mechanism. And it's a way Bob will take Alice's public key, encrypt the key he wants her to use, send it over. She will use her private key to open up the box and reveal the key that's there. Okay, so it's now changing from key exchange to key encapsulation, and it's a different mechanism with post-quantum cryptography. One of the main places we use public key encryption is with digital signatures. So now Bob wants to prove that he is Bob, and he does that with his private key. So he takes a hash of the message and then will sign that hash with his private key. He will then send his public key in some way to Alice. Alice then verifies the signature that it's valid. It's a verification process. Okay, so this is the digital signature process that we go through to verify that Bob is Bob. And Bob is really proving that he's Bob because he has the private key here and no one else in the world has that private key. Okay, so signatures are fundamentally important to be able to prove that things are what they should be. So if we look at the whole mechanism of what happens with a communication when we use TLS or HTTPS, then basically what happens is initially there's a key exchange with elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman, and at the end of that, Bob and Alice will have the same shared symmetric key, typically AES or CHA-20. Okay, so they both have the same key that they can use, and now they can encrypt the traffic between them using that symmetric key. But the problem with this is that there can be an Eve in the middle in the key exchange. How can we make sure that we are communicating with the website that we want, and it's not a fake website? So for this, we create a key pair for Alice, and Alice will sign some data with her private key, and then Bob will prove the signature on that with her public key. So the way that we get the public key is that Alice gives the public key to Trent, who's a trusted entity. We call them a CA or certificate authority or an intermediate certificate authority. They take her public key and then they sign with their own private key to verify that Alice's public key is correct. From there, they wrap that in a certificate X509, and then that is sent from Alice, that certificate is sent from Alice to Bob. Bob then checks the validity of the certificate, that it's been signed properly by Trent, and then we'll extract Alice's public key, and from that, we'll be able to verify the signature. Okay, that's the mechanism that really holds both security, privacy, and trust on the internet. And it's fundamental. And all of this will break. All of it will break. So this will break because it's elliptic curve, and all of the public keys that are created for the signatures will break. So we're in a troubled phase, and we have 5 to 10 years to really migrate away from most of what we're using here overall. Okay, so let's look at some standards that have been created for post-quantum cryptography. So we need hard problems that are existing computers and also quantum computers will be able to still find hard. It doesn't do any good to have a new method that a quantum computer would find hard, but our existing computers would not. So the 5 main methods that have been selected in terms of hard problems for a quantum computer are what are called hash-based methods. So these are using what are called Merkle trees to be able to have a root public key and multiple private keys from there. And it's ultra secure. So if you really want the best security ever from this, then it's likely to be this hash-based approach. It's been around for a long time, well proven. We can also use coding methods such as error correcting codes and so on that you would find in a CD-ROM and so on. They can be used to replace our existing public key methods. Multivariate is a rather strange method. It's quite time consuming, but it's been considered at the current time for another standard. The one that sticks out the most is these lattice methods. Lattice methods are relatively small keys. They're still larger than existing ones, but they're not too bad in terms of size, and the performance is pretty good. If you're interested, it's based on the old machine learning method of learning with errors. And basically, we create a multi-dimensional matrix, typically with 1,000 accesses. If you can imagine lots of points in space with 1,000 accesses. And then each of these points in space, we add a little bit of an error to the vector, and actually, when you're adding the error, it's really difficult. It's a hard problem to find the nearest node to that point that we've created. But if we have a secret key, private key, then we actually have the secret to be able to map the point back to where it should be. So lattice methods are the ones that are at the fore. They've been around for 10 years at least, fairly well researched, but there is still a slight question mark about them that they could be cracked. So who knows? So NIST are making sure that there is an alternative method, such as the hash-based ones overall. And then we have a cute little one called isogenes, which still use elliptic curves, so it's really good that they're still used. But isogenes can be a little bit slow. The core advantage of them is that we'd be able to use the Diffie-Hellman method with isogenes. But what happened was in the final round of the competition, a method called Psych was in the final, and someone cracked it over a weekend on an old laptop. So it had to withdraw from the competition, and the isogeny methods are not seen to be at the fore because the team who submitted Psych used bad selection of parameters. If they had selected better parameters, it wouldn't have been cracked. So isogenes isn't doing as well as it was in the past, but it's likely to become a standard, hopefully sometime in the future. So the competition went through several rounds. It was evaluated for its performance, for key generation, for the signature generation, and so on. And they were evaluated, obviously, for the security and peer-reviewed by researchers across the world. These were the contenders for each of the rounds. And for key exchange, it was the lattice method of Crystal's Kyber, which won. And then for signatures, the three that were selected were Crystal's Dilithium, Vulcan, and Sphinx Plus. So all of these three methods are lattice-based ones, and this one here is a hash-based one. Basically, these ones, the lattice ones, have got relatively small key sizes, and the performance is very good. And the signature size is also quite reasonable too. And this one here, the key sizes are extremely small, but the signature size is much bigger. So this one has a slight problem, but it's ultra secure. Falcon is interesting because it creates smaller key sizes than dilithium, and perhaps in blockchain applications, Falcon would be better than Lattice. So the two lattice methods here actually differ in how they're implemented and could have different applications overall. Okay, so to give you some idea of what the key sizes look like, so for Kyber, which is the key exchange, public key encryption method, is 800 bytes for the public key, 1600 for the private key, and then the ciphertext that's passed is 768 bytes. So that goes up quite a lot from our existing elliptic curve methods from there. You can see that some of the key sizes for some of the other methods are absolutely massive, and Maclise still hasn't been standardized just because it's so slow, and also for the key sizes that are actually involved. When it comes to signatures, then dilithium is not too bad. It's about 1300 bytes for the public key. So this is 128-bit security. This is 192-bit security, and this is 256-bit security. So there's three different levels for the equivalent security that we actually have. But the starting point is about 1300 for the public key, 2500 for the private key, and about 2400 bytes for the signature that dilithium actually creates. If we look at our existing methods of elliptic curve, we can see that it has tiny little keys Even RSA has a smaller keys than dilithium. So we're going to have to increase the key sizes up for everything that we create, and also for the signatures and the public keys. Okay, so for key exchange, if we went for both our existing ECDH and Kyber, then the data packet would have 864 bytes in it, which is fine because we can hold up to about 1500 bytes in a packet. So there will be no overhead in migrating towards Kyber overall. And then for signatures, it's a bit more. With dilithium, we need about 2,500 bytes for the public key, the public value to be passed, which would mean that we need two packets to be sent to hold a single public key. But if we used a method called Sphinx Plus, we would need 12 packets because it has a signature value of 17,800 bytes. Okay, so the methods aren't called by their original names at the current time. So Kyber has been renamed MLKEM, or lattice key encapsulation mechanism. The lithium is known as MLDSA, this lattice digital signature algorithm. And the Sphinx Plus is known as SLH DSA. That should be DSA at the end. MLKEM, or Kyber, is known as FIPS 203 as the standard, and MLDSA is known as FIPS 204. The Sphinx Plus SLH DSA is known as FIPS 205. Falcon is coming along and will be known as FIPS 206. And these will be the standards that everyone will have to abide by. 2030, the public key methods must be deprecated, and 2035, they must be gone. Okay, every piece of public key encryption and symmetric key up to 128 and hash will have to be gone by 2035, which isn't a long time, really, when you think that some companies have billions of keys that they have to manage and signatures. That isn't a long time to migrate. So as I said, because of Grover's algorithm, we need to move 128-bit and 160-bit to 256-bit hashes. We need to move our symmetric key methods towards 256 bits. We need to move the key exchange methods, ECDH, X25519, and RSA key exchange towards these Kyber methods from there. For public key encryption, we use RSA OAEP, and we'll have to move that to the MLKEM. It won't be a pure MLKEM because it needs to be a hybrid method. So we need to be using symmetric key with public key encryption. If anybody's interested in what that mechanism is, then please contact me. But basically, we can't encrypt large amounts of data with MLKEM. We can only encrypt something like an encryption key. When it comes to signatures, ECDSA, as used in Bitcoin and Ethereum, will have to be migrated towards MLDSA or SLHDSA. And this includes the RSA signatures of RSA PSS. Okay, and this is the Willow chip here that Microsoft have actually produced and is actually starting to build at scale. Okay, so just as a last little point, I've created, just to show that it can be done. Some people say, oh, what about the performance of this? Don't worry about the performance. They're generally as fast as most of the elliptic curve methods, and certainly faster than the RSA methods. So these methods that we've outlined here are actually pretty good in terms of performance. And just to show that, here is JavaScript implementation. So I've implemented this with JavaScript. If you want to run the code, it's on this page and we'll put it on the site. But I can regenerate my keys. So what we're seeing here is me generating the public key of Bob and Alice. And then we're creating the ciphertext using, I think, Alice's public, we're using Alice's public key to encrypt the data. We then get the cipher, which is ciphertext, which then gets passed, and then we can decrypt it with Alice's private key here. Okay, and then hopefully we end up with the same shared key overall. Okay, that's it here. Okay, there's the shared key that we have from our key exchange. This is Alice's public key that we're using to encrypt the key that Bob wants her to use, and this is her private key that she will then decrypt that, and then Alice will receive this value here. This was the value that Bob created initially. We can make it a bit bigger, so let's try these bigger keys. There we go. And we should be able to see the keys get bigger there. And we'll try for the biggest size of keys. And then we'll generate the keys again. And we'll see that the keys are even bigger this time. So this is 256-bit. But always Bob and Alice will create the same shared key. For MLDSA, which is Kyber, so we can do the same thing. So in this case, we'll take a message. We could write the message here, and we can see the signature is being created here. We're basically taking the private key here, and we're creating the signature from that, and then we verify the signature with the public key here. We can see that this is working perfectly. Try to increase the security level, and we'll see that the signature is increasing. And we'll try again, and we'll try again. We can see that there's an even bigger signature there. Okay, so the days of small signatures are actually going overall. Okay, so thanks very much for listening.